Boom! We're off and running. Hello! Welcome along. It's Tuesday evening and it's time to talk about children's, youth and families ministry. Remember, keep an ear out for our movie quote for the week. Last week, Rod got it. The week before, Kylie got it. So, see if you can grab the movie quote, work out what movie it comes from, and we'll get a lucky winner. So make sure once you hear the quote, try and pop it in as quickly as possible. See if you can win this week. As always, we want to recognise that we meet on land that God has created, as God has created the whole of the world. And in each place, God has set particular people to care for the land. And in this place of Southside, that for a long time has been the Yagara and the Turrbal people, who have cared for this land and nurtured and shepherded this land. And we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging for the work that they have done to preserve God's creation, to search for God's presence. And we pray for conciliation between us and them. We pray for reconciliation between God and all peoples. So, welcome along. Title, I'm sure, is fascinating you. Ethnography, what does that mean? Well, before we get on to that, we better have a movie quote, hadn't we? So, last week, I was going to say The Matrix, but it wasn't The Matrix. That was the week before. Last week was Top Gun. I feel the need for speed. So well done to Rod for getting that one. This week's, hopefully everyone who's going to be on, we've got 2 viewers. Maybe we'll hold off for a moment. So ethnography, what does that mean? And so we've been working through this book, A Critical Approach to Youth Culture. So trying to work out its influences, implications for ministry. So obviously, if we're trying to reach out to young people, we need to try and understand what are the culture they're coming from. So if missionaries go to China, Japan, Botswana, they learn the language, they try and learn the culture before they go in. And to fully explain the gospel, you need to understand the culture. So you hear stories of, trying to think, no, it's gone. Wonderful story that we did on Mission Perspectives at college about trying to find a word, and the people sort of went off and came back with this word that they were to describe God. But it's gone. That's 20 odd years ago. Well, I must be pretty old, mustn't I? But just as we try and learn the culture as we go, missionaries go to another country, as we minister with children, youth, families, we are stepping into other cultures. And so we need to try and explore and understand what that culture that we're trying to reach into is. And so the ethnographer's job is to try and understand culture. So they look at from the outside and the inside, and they try to work out, what is this culture? How does it relate to my culture? What are the differences? What are the similarities? How do I understand what this culture is? And so it's important for youth ministry to be trying to explore what is the culture, or what is the cultures that we're working with. And yeah, it's important because what are the people that we're reaching? And we've talked about there's no homogenous youth culture anymore. There's sort of subsets and groups and things like that. So we need to work out what are the young people that we are connecting with and how can we connect with them better. So we need to be ethnographers. We need to be reading the culture and trying to understand it. Okay. Oh, we'll go to 5 minutes and then we'll do the movie quote. How's that? Give people a chance to walk in. Got to make it fair, don't you, apparently? Used to have, I'm sure I've told you this story before, used to do games with Kylie's brother David in Sunday school, and kids go, oh, it's not fair. It's like, life's not fair. Get used to it. So mean, aren't we? It's a grumpy old man at a very early age. So we need to be doing the role of the ethnographer to understand what is the culture we're reaching into, who are the people. So I've talked about before, as I was rereading this stuff this afternoon for tonight reminded me of in Belmont. I'm sure I talked about before. We had three big youth groups, or three main youth groups. You had the Salvos, you had the Baptists, and you had us at the Uniting Church. The Salvos did skate comps and big band nights, and that was their thing. And that was the culture of the kids that they were drawing in. The Baptists were sort of connecting in with the Christian college because they oversaw it. I'm sure there's a better word for that, but it was under their auspices. It's a big word. And we, because most of our kids went to the Tuesday lunchtime program, apparently one of the teachers or some of the teachers said to the RI teacher at one stage, "Oh, that's social outcast group." So we had sort of the nerdy, socially awkward group. And so it was important. One time we joined the Baptists and did a big band night. It was clear, like, or big music night and stuff. And it was like, my kids don't want that. That doesn't connect with them. That's not the culture they're coming from. So how do we do stuff that meets their culture? Which means we're not going to connect with every child. And meant that there were a couple of our teenagers that from our church, who didn't connect with our youth group. And it's like, well, go over to the Salvos. They're doing the stuff that you're into. Go over there. It doesn't go well with parents. Yes. Won't bring out my bitter side on that one. But, yeah. We need to be aware of who are we reaching, how are we connecting. Okay, 5 minutes. If you're not here by now, you're going to miss out. So, our movie quote for this week is, "A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a Chianti." Where does that come from? Do it again. Ready? Channel that actor. Not going to say who. Channel that actor. Channel that movie. "A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a Chianti." Can you work out what movie that comes from? There you go. Put it in the comments. First person to get the correct answer wins a prize. Hey, we give prizes away now on Tuesday evenings. Prizes are plenty. That's what youth group's about. And it's better than a nice feeling deep down inside. I'll tell you that. That'll be a chocolate. I'm going to get some of those furry friends. You can have a furry friend. Because you're my friend that watches here, so you can have a nice furry friend chocolate. To go with your liver. And fava beans and a little candy. Where does that come from? It's on the tip of your tongue, isn't it? Hopefully not the liver and the rest. Yeah. So why do we do ethnography? And so Pamela Irwin, one day I will get that name without having to turn the page to see it. Talks about a number of strengths that the pastoral ethnography does. That if we're doing ethnography, if we're trying to understand the culture, these are the add-ons to the ministry that we will be doing. So firstly, it is increased understanding of youth. So simply, if we're trying to understand their culture, we will understand the youth better. And obviously that can only be good for ministry. The more we understand someone, the more we can reach out to them. The more we understand someone, the more we can connect with them. Oh no, the other person wins. Rod, you can't think of where that story comes from. That quote comes from. Oh no. Made it too hard. That's all right. Your picture hasn't popped up, so I was waiting for you, but obviously you were here and your picture's hiding today. Keeping me on my toes. Joy of technology. Don't assume that it's doing what it's meant to be doing. So young people are different, and we need to understand who they are and what their culture is, how we can connect with them. So as we understand their culture, we can understand more of who they are, and we can share our gospel related to where they are. So I think I talked about a little while ago, around Easter time, the different ways of looking at the cross, in John Driver's book of, I think it's 12 ways of looking at the cross, and his recognition, and I've forgotten who the person who unpacked it for me was. Steve, no. Anyway, him. Is that at different times and for different people, a different way of looking at the cross will be relevant. So if you're going through a horrible time, that sense of Jesus taking on the pain and going through pain with us, that might be the message of the cross that connects with you. If you're feeling hopeless, then maybe that God's acceptance and forgiveness through the cross is for you, or whatever. And so as we understand the young people we're dealing with, we can aim our message better at them. We can connect into where they are at. So doing ethnography helps us to increases our understanding of youth. Next thing, it helps with adult leader training. So as we understand what's going on at the youth culture level, we can train our leaders to be having conversations about those issues. And so there's been a big push within the Uniting Church in New South Wales through their Pulse unit around the Strike for Climate, and there was a bunch of them at that Strike for Climate rally last week. In that sense of this is what our young people are passionate about. How are we connecting in with that? And how do we train our leaders, adult leaders, to be in conversations around these, which is more than just, yes, the world's an exciting place and we should save it, but also that, God calls us to care for this land. And that as we start each week, this is the land that God has created, and so we're called to steward it and care for it. And so how do we have those conversations so that young people don't just get caught up on a cause and do it for the cause without understanding the spiritual implications for that cause? Yes, it can be wonderful to be eco-friendly, but it's even better to be eco-friendly because this is God's creation. Numerous other things, Obviously, for me, at the moment, that awareness of Israel-Palestine. I have a friend who is a journalist, lives in Gaza, and that concern and that, we stand up for peace and justice there and call for that and pray for that because that's what God calls us to. It's not just, we don't like people being bombed. It's, God actually calls us. There is no Greek, there's no Jew. And that struggle that some conservative Christians, it's the Jews against the Muslims. Well, no, a bunch of Palestinians are actually Christians. So how do we do that? I'll stop preaching. So we can, understanding culture, we can help our leaders and train our leaders to be having conversations around those issues. And so our brigades are starting to think through, and I'll be working with Caitlin about how we have conversations around gender equality, which for some of our leaders is a radical thing, but for most of our young people who are in that group, they'll be talking about that at school. It'll be, this is the stuff. So how do we engage in that conversation so they're getting a Christian influence onto that? Because there's no male or female in Christ. We're all one. How do we have that equality? How do we point them to, this is God stuff. This is not just nice, happy stuff. So, as we understand culture, we can help to train our adults. It recognises that community matters. So, it's a greater ability to see what matters in community. So again, what's going on? How do we connect in with what's happening in the community? How do we connect in with the marches for climate change? How do we connect in? Where are the places our young people are passionate about? And how do we support that passion? I've said it before, if we don't give our young people something to die for, they'll go and find it somewhere else. And so we need to be finding where are those things that they want to die for? And how do we input God into that? And so the next part of Pamela's strengths is it facilitates theological thinking. There you go. You've often thought, how do I facilitate theological thinking? That's really good. So theological thinking is when we put an issue through the biblical lens. And go, well, how does that relate to God? So the climate change stuff, how does that actually, we put it through that lens of this is God's creation. We are called to be stewards. Genesis calls man and woman to care for the world and the creation and be stewards over it. We've often sometimes thought about that as rule over it and, whip it into shape, which is why our climate is in the state it's in, possibly. But yes, how do we facilitate that theological talk? How do we get and ground the issues that are important to young people into faith stuff? And that will facilitate new practices. So as we hear issues, well, how do we live that out? How do we come up with some spiritual practices that link in with that? What are the gaps that we have? And so, yeah, he talks about a group, or she talks about a group. Pam Richardson, that's gender bias, isn't it? I just naturally went to him. She, Pamela. Pamela is a she. She talks about a youth group where they would often sit and the youth pastor would encourage kids to bring along a song, and they would sit and listen to it and talk through the issues from it. We did a little bit of that on Sunday. We encouraged the young people, bring along your favourite song and let's listen to it. And thank you to Jack Bielenberg for rolling us with Rick Astley, Never Gonna Give You Up. That was beautiful. Taran's Fishy Wolf Wish Wah 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 song from High School Musical, which taught me why I've never watched High School Musical. But she loved it. That was good. So it allows new practices. We get to hear new things. And sorry, I think I heard myself on Kylie's thing. It naturally follows that just as doing pastoral ethnography facilitates theological thinking, it also facilitates new practices in the youth ministry. So yes, how are we doing new things? How are we picking up new ways to connect with our young people? Oh, this is culture. How do we do stuff around climate, if that's the big thing? Are we going and worshipping outdoors? Is that's what meaningful? You know, if you're living down the beach and you've got a bunch of surfies, are you having, you know, that's your culture. Do you have church on the beach? You know, how do we provide new cultures that connect with what the new practices that connect with what the culture is doing? So, to help us with ethnography, how do we do it? So they quote Bonhoeffer, which is obviously, they've got a date, which is obviously when their version of Bonhoeffer was written, because it's long after Bonhoeffer died. 1978, Bonhoeffer dying in about 44, 45, just before Germany is liberated. But he says the first service that one owes to others in the fellowship consists in listening to them, just as love to God begins with listening to his word. So the beginning of love for the brethren is learning to listen to them. Christians, especially ministers, so often think they must always contribute something when they are in the company of others. That is the one service that they have to render. They forget that listening can be a greater service than speaking. So again, we've talked about that before. How do we allow our young people to teach in church? The minister doesn't actually have to always do it. There's other ways. And so how do we build up ethnography? We cultivate watchfulness. So we start to watch what's going on around us. We see what are we observing in the culture? What are we observing amongst our young people? What are the things they do that are the same to us? What are the things that they do are different to us? Then cultivate an attitude of listening. So how do we listen to them? How do we go, bring along your music, we're just going to listen. And we're going to hear what you're passionate about, what excites you. One of them apparently Footloose. That's fine. What excites them? How do we just listen? How do we sit back? Just listen. And that recognizes that we have to give up. And so when we listen and when we encourage young people to tell their stories, we have to give up control, because we don't always know where that story might take us, which can be scary. Most leaders like to have control. We write up risk assessments to show we are in control. listening to young people, allowing them space to talk and to share what's important, can be dangerous, or can be challenging, and can have that risk of we no longer have control. We can be there to support, to walk alongside, to probably rein it in if it's really going off track, but we need to allow some space to, whatever song you want, we will play it. Even if it's horrible, we'll listen to it at the end. Although Jack decided we didn't really need to listen to all of Rick Astley's Never Gonna Give You Up. Never gonna let you down, never gonna run around and hurt you. I'll stop. Again, as we are trying to do this ethnography, we're incorporating new practices. So what are those new practices we need? What are those things that are happening around us that we need to incorporate into what we're doing? It cultivates all your senses. So you're looking. They draw on the idea of looking at art, and the story of Henry Nouwen on the Nouwen and his book on the turn of the prodigal son. Yes, talks about how he sat in front of Rembrandt's picture for hours and just suddenly I noticed that. Oh, I haven't noticed that bit before. How do we just sit and allow and discover? Maybe that's our spiritual exercise of just sitting and observing the culture around us. Cultivates an attitude of humility. And so they draw on, Moses, when God calls him, he's like, no, not the right person. You can pick someone better. How do we come to this with humility? That as we come with humility, we are able to rely on God more. We're able to listen and learn from the young people more. It's not I come into this space with all the answers, but I come in and I don't know it all. It's my real challenge. Heard me say it before. How do I sometimes just shut up and say, okay, what is it? So I was doing RI today, and one of the activities that I meant to do in their book is write down questions about Jesus. And so I got them a couple, anyone, do you want to share your question? And instead of doing my usual, I'll answer that, it's like, that's a good question. When will we see Jesus? That's a good question. What's heaven like? That's a good question. How do we just do that? I think it's Mark Iaconelli tells a story of a church that he knows where the minister just said, rightio, for the next 6 months, I'm not going to preach a sermon. Kids aren't going to go out. We're going to just sit here and we're going to ask questions. And they just sit there in silence, and someone would ask a question, you go, that's a good question. And he'd sit down and they'd wait, and someone else would ask a question, that's a good question. And following on from that, they put together where are we heading in our preaching series, but just spent a few months of just going, we're just going to listen. We're going to hear questions. Which next, what we need to do is cultivate an attitude of curiosity. So how do we want to know what's going on for the culture of our young people? What's going on? What are you into? What's Fortnite or TikTok or all these things? How are we trying to draw and talk to them? Ethnography, you need to cultivate a sense of humour. So, and not just, having fun and playing games, but cultivate a sense of humour. Not the wild wackiness that often characterises youth ministry, but a sense of noting the strange and amusing aspects of life and culture. So just go, that's different, that's amusing. Had a moment of humour. Was looking through and reading all of my documents for Church Council on Thursday. I'm absolutely reading them all. And there's one document going requesting the presbytery to give me approval to preside at sacraments. And the recommendation said, we ask the South Morton Presbytery to preside at the sacraments. It's like, okay, I think you've missed some words there about giving Richard permission. So we had a good laugh about it, and David resent the document out with. Made a couple of changes. Amazing how a couple of little words can make a huge difference. I thought maybe we're just going, if Richard can't do communion, none of the ministers will, and we'll just get the presbytery to come in and do all our communion services. I think I've said before, the Baptist Union response to women in ministry, so I heard at one stage, was, we just won't ordain anybody. If we're not sure whether to ordain women or not, which let's not ordain men either. Get rid of the problem. So have a sense of humour. Laugh about it. If you don't laugh in youth ministry, you'll go crazy. In children's ministry, you just got to sometimes laugh. Not necessarily at the kids, but with the kids. Yep. They're going to be that today. That's all right. And we need to cultivate a sense of ethics. So as we are discovering the culture of young people, we care for them. And it's not about manipulating them. It's not about, how do we take what they're telling us and spread it everywhere. But how do we work within ethical boundaries to discover who our young people are and treat that knowledge with care and honour the gifts that they are sharing. So we've talked about that before. How do we honour their gifts of sharing and knowledge and culture? So, we are to be ethnographers, trying to understand this culture. That as we do this, we'll understand our young people better. We'll be able to interact with where their passions are and help them to see God in those passions. And to have those theological discussions about the big issues. We can walk alongside them in those big issues. And we do that by listening to them, by giving up control and going, tell us your story, wherever that goes. By, just spending that time in silence and observing what's going on around us and all those other things. So, there's some thoughts for this week. Remember, a censer taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and Chianti. You're all going to go and have to Google it, I guess. But if you Google it, don't put it up. We'll see if anyone knows. I'll tell you the answer next week, because someone might watch during the week and know it. I'll tell you next week. Thanks for tuning in again. Appreciate those that tune in regularly, whether you tune in live or whether you tune in at a later time. Thank you for joining us. Again, hopefully this stuff is helpful, particularly for those of you who are passionately working with young people. Hopefully this stuff is helping you to think about, how do you do that better? How are you connecting with these young people and seeing them and hearing their stories, and even in the midst of chaos and, Friday nights and all those sorts of things. So thank you for tuning in. I will let you head off to Bible studies and whatever else you're doing this evening. I hope you stay healthy. I hope Kylie, who's just liked, isn't talking, because Oliver is going to stand on her feet every time she talks, because she's losing her voice at the moment. And we'll see you again. Yes, glad you're liking and glad it's helpful. Have a good one, guys and girls.